My daughter took this this morning. She came much pregnant. She took her dog for a walk in the park. Dog came home with his police shot. What is your name? My name is Ron. And her pet, Laci Peterson. His dog over the park. What's your daughter's name? Laci Peterson.
Seems that when she got pregnant with Connor, things started going sideways.
The first person you focus on in a homicide investigation is the person closest to the victim and the last person to see the victim. And of course, boom, boom, we got both of those with Scott.
He claims that he woke up in the morning and he and Laci had breakfast together. He thought maybe he was going to play golf, but because it was rainy and cold, he decided not to play golf, but to go fishing.
I'm a very cynical person when it comes to spousal mystery. I always blame the husband, and I am almost always right.
At the time, the public was already becoming suspicious of Scott Peterson as more and more information came out about Scott, and I'm learning more from law enforcement on what's happening. I realized they were zeroing in on Scott.
We've been through so much these last days that I'd like to make a plea to the person or persons who have my daughter. Please bring our daughter home.
At the end of our last episode, the search for Laci Peterson began to stretch into its third week. Her family and friends worked non-stop over the previous 16 days to locate her, and thousands turned out to help. At this point, Laci was less than a month away from giving birth to her first baby, a little boy she'd already named Connor. But as the days passed and investigators discovered several lies, and an uncanny number of coincidences surrounding his alibi, her perfect hubby Scott remained the central focus of the investigation. The press was kept in the loop about some of the most suspicious details and used them as well as some others they'd fabricated on their own, to fuel the fire against him amongst the public. Aware he'd taken a last-minute fishing trip to Berkeley on the morning his wife vanished from their home in Modesto, and knowing he'd made several shady trips back to the Marino where he'd launched his new boat that fateful day, police were watching Scott like a hawk in order to gather stronger evidence against him, and it wasn't long before they found it. Or should we say, before it found them. On the 9th of January, a surveillance camera trained on the house watched him pack 2 suitcases into a rented truck, a little after 7 o'clock that morning. By 10:30 he was headed west for another strange trip to Berkeley, where very similar to his previous visits, Scott circled a parking lot and spent several minutes looking out at the water before leaving, again not speaking to any members of the search and rescue team, or approaching anyone from law enforcement while he was there, causing detectives to doubt his later claims about making the trip to the bay to learn more about the search for his wife. When Scott left the marina, he headed south to the San Luis Forebay. The Forebay is a large body of water connecting to the San Luis Reservoir, and after reading the area was added to the list of search locations in the newspaper, Scott decided to stop there on his way to Bakersfield where he had a business meeting. After leaving the reservoir, which is coincidentally not far from Los Baños, the same town her stepfather Ron Gransky traveled to on the morning Laci disappeared, Scott continued on to the Doubletree Hotel in Bakersfield and checked in for the night. But that afternoon back in Modesto, Sharon received a call from Sergeant Cloward, just before the police announced that their sonar scans had likely discovered a body in the bay that morning. The divers had a hit on the equipment, but just afterward they called off further investigation of the object and pulled the team out of the water, citing poor weather conditions and diver fatigue. Experts criticized their decision to halt the search without attempting a recovery, or at least confirming what the object was. As Sergeant Cloward explained to Sharon that the sonar had no way of telling a large piece of debris from a human body, his attempt to soften the news for Sharon and leave her with some hope that it wasn't her daughter they'd found, also tells us that what they saw on the 9th and what they recovered on the 11th when they got back in the water, very likely may have been 2 different things. The equipment was sensitive enough to tell the difference between a can of beer and a tire, so it seems whatever they saw on their scans on the 9th was big, and must have had a similar shape to a human, for them to announce their assumption to the watching world. But as we'll learn in a moment, The mysterious object they found on the ocean floor had either of those characteristics, and may have effectively validated the commentary from critics who were baffled by their decision to stop investigating and leave the potential body at the mercy of the ocean for another 2 days, knowing the tides, currents, and predators could cause the object to move or be significantly damaged before it could be recovered. But as the divers rested and Sharon anxiously watched the sky for the weather to clear, rumors swirled about what their scans picked up, and speculation ran wild over what, or possibly who, was found in the water. By the following day, people all over the city were already hearing that authorities had in fact located a body, but it wasn't Laci's. We'll even hear Scott discuss the rumor on the phone with a friend just after the mysterious object was finally recovered, and we'll also learn how we know exactly what Scott told his buddy that day, and how he reacted to learning what the sonar really picked up. An application for a wiretap was approved the day after the announcement about the body, which was the 10th, and it subjected Scott's phone calls to recording without his knowledge, though they didn't begin receiving the audio until the 11th. So before we get into some of the crazy things they recorded on Scott's phone, let's go over a few general details about the wiretap, and a quick mention of how they got the application approved. First off, it's not easy to get approval to record a citizen's private phone conversations without their permission in California, and the number of warrants issued for phone wires across the state that year was around 1,200, with a majority of those being installed in cases of homicide, kidnapping, and white-collar crimes such as fraud and tax evasion. The surveillance of the phone lines began on January the 11th and remained in place until February 4th, during which time investigators documented nearly 4,000 calls, either to or from Scott's home and cell phone. Many of these calls were made by members of the media, such as NBC's Jody Hernandez, who called Scott nearly 50 times to arrange a single interview. At the time, some legal experts suspected that the wiretaps were intentionally directed to capture Scott's conversations with the press, and they believed that the dialogue with reporters may have been the primary target of the surveillance. Their theory was that sensitive information from Scott's conversations with the media would be concealed in the reporter's notes, making it difficult for the district attorney to access later for trial. Without the ability to record them with the wiretap, prosecutors would have to attempt to get subpoenas or warrants for the information. While Scott was certainly being hounded by the media, his relationship hadn't warmed to them by mid-January, but somewhat ironically, the affidavit used to secure the approval of the wiretap included mention of one of the biggest names in television, Martha Stewart. Martha, or rather her show Martha Stewart Living, would become a sort of witness for Scott's defense during the trial later, but in early January, as detectives completed their application for a wiretap against Scott, they used her program to obtain what would become some of the most damaging pieces of evidence against him: his recorded phone conversations. Scott told Detective Al Brocchini that on the morning of Christmas Eve, during some of his last moments with his wife, they watched part of her favorite show, Martha Stewart. He said Martha was baking with meringue during the segment he saw before he left for Berkeley on his fishing trip. But a week or so later, when the detective reviewed the tape, he didn't see any mention of meringue and concluded Scott was lying. Brocchini informed his colleagues working the case with him, and later used the claim to help them obtain the wiretap on his phones. 69 of the calls were between Scott and his attorney at the time, Kirk McAllister, which fall outside of wiretap rules and were considered privileged information. Those monitoring the calls were told to familiarize themselves with McAllister's phone numbers to prevent recording them, and they were given instructions to stop recording after a lawyer identifies themselves on the line. They have a set amount of time to stop monitoring a privileged call. However, there's mention of a possible violation of this law later, and accusations were made about law enforcement listening to Scott speak with his attorney, well after he identified himself, but we'll go into that in a later episode as we discuss more about the trial. But it seems unlikely Scott would be sharing much with the media. While he would do a couple of infamous interviews toward the end of January, he'd adamantly avoided the press over the past 2 weeks and was probably well aware of the articles published just 2 days prior, insinuating that he very well could be a serial killer, making him far less likely to begin opening up to reporters over the phone or otherwise. Yes, indeed, it would take something big to get Scott Peterson in front of a camera after they accused him of being a serial murderer, especially during the early part of January when he was still looking to keep his dirty secrets buried, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Headlines connecting him to Kristen Smart's disappearance in the spring of 1996 began to circulate the day before authorities announced they'd found a body in the bay, and the stories quickly gained momentum. We'll recall that Scott and Laci were both attending Cal Poly when fellow student, 19-year-old Kristen Smart, vanished after a campus party. Her true killer, Paul Flores, was finally sentenced just last week to 25 years to life for her murder, and although his defense attempted to subpoena Scott Peterson to testify as a viable alternative suspect, the judge tossed it out because he'd been cleared by the Modesto PD during the initial investigation into Laci Peterson. But back then, shortly after the connection with Kristen and Cal Poly was made, the press continued to accelerate the story, until the 19th of January when much smaller headlines announced that he wasn't involved. As Scott continued his struggle with the media, Ron and Sharon used every bit of exposure they could get to keep Laci's name in the headlines, hoping to fuel the search to find her, and the next day Sharon awoke early to do just that. She and Ron had press engagements planned for the entire morning, and though she was barely sleeping anyway, on the 10th she was up hours before the sun rose. She was scheduled at 4 o'clock that morning to record interviews for the Today Show and Good Morning America via satellite at the police station, before participating in a 3-hour radio show remotely from the Volunteer Center. When the radio show wrapped, Sharon watched part of her earlier recording on the Today Show and was shocked by her appearance. She was visibly overrun with stress and exhaustion, and she looked terrible, almost sickly. Her eyes were sunken, her face pale, thin, and barely recognizable. It scared her to death, but as she looked at the physical impact this nightmare had made on her, the fear wasn't out of concern for herself, but for Laci. Sharon considered the state of her own body, and her mind kept returning to her pregnant daughter, terrified thinking of the condition she must be in after being out there who knows where, all alone. Later that morning, Scott's sister Susan asked Ron and Sharon if they thought whoever took Laci might dump her body in the bay. Ron raised his eyebrows at her as if to say, "Come again?" They were all well aware Scott's fishing trip saturated the news since the day after Laci went missing, and Susan worried that the people who were really responsible might see a prime opportunity to push the blame off onto Scott. And for a short time, Sharon agreed. She thought Susan's theory might very well be possible, at least when she first heard it, but Ron certainly didn't. He immediately said, "Of course not. Why on earth would someone risk being caught putting her there with the place crawling with police?" When Susan suggested someone might be looking to frame him, Sharon changed the subject by asking her, "Where's Scott?" Susan said he had some business to deal with, but that wasn't helpful to Sharon, and she asked again where he was, this time more forcefully. His sister told her he had to go out of town, but didn't specify where. Turns out he was headed to Bakersfield for his business trip and due to return sometime that afternoon, though it wouldn't be another 24 hours before detectives began catching him in a string of deception about his travels. They began recording the lies he told Sharon, his parents and others, about where he was, as divers resumed their recovery efforts of the mysterious object in the bay. On the morning of the 11th, Sharon checked her calendar. It was a Saturday, and she'd had the entire afternoon marked off for Laci's baby shower. But instead of picking up the cake for baby Connor's party, she went to the window with a pit in her stomach. She peered out at the clearing clouds and knew the divers would likely resume their search now that the weather'd improved. But she stayed optimistic, telling Brent and Amy that whatever they'd found on their sonar 2 days before, it wasn't Laci and Connor. She just had a feeling and said she knew, though it didn't help her to get through the day knowing they still weren't home safe. Brent tried to share in his mother's optimism and continued to help with the search and investigation as much as he could. The day before, as Scott made his massive detour to the marina before heading to Bakersfield on business, Brent's wife Rose was interviewed by detectives. They wanted to know where her husband was on the 23rd and 24th of December. And though Brent was already interviewed and gave his whereabouts during the time frame his sister went missing, they also spoke with his employer looking to confirm his alibi, mainly out of a concern for a possible financial motive. When law enforcement learned the details about the inheritance he and his sisters were slated to split from their grandparents' estate, they thoroughly investigated Brent, and his half-sister Amy as well. The 3 siblings stood to receive roughly $485,000 to be split among them after they reached the age of 30, and law enforcement wanted to be certain Laci's siblings hadn't decided to remove her from the equation. Brent and Amy not only sat openly through several interviews and cooperated fully with all parts of the investigation, they both submitted to polygraph testing sometime after their alibis were confirmed, and were swiftly cleared as suspects. Sharon had been right about the weather that morning, and when divers recovered an old anchor from the water several hours later, she was one of the first people authorities called with the update. Relieved, and looking to share the good news, she called Scott, but he didn't answer, so she left a message on his voicemail. Now that police had a wiretap in place, they listened in as he played the message back later, and what they heard certainly got their attention. As he listened to Sharon's message letting him know that the object on the sonar wasn't a body, but an anchor, Scott let out a long whistle, and detectives took it as a reflection of his relief. Though they didn't suspect it was the same relief Sharon was feeling knowing it wasn't Laci they'd pulled from the water, reviving her hopes of seeing her again. Investigators thought it was the whistle of a man relieved after nearly being caught in a close call, such as police finding his murdered wife in the ocean where he dumped her, but just to clarify, authorities didn't connect the anchor they recovered to Scott or his boat. They'd captured this whistle just hours after the audio began to come in over the wiretap, and the rest of the calls he made that day only served to bury him deeper. Scott lied to several people about his whereabouts on the afternoon of the 11th, though we're not sure why. He told Sharon, his parents, and a close friend that he was in Fresno or Bakersfield that day, depending on who he was talking to, and he told another caller he was in a place called Buttonwillow, but his phone logged his locations near cell towers over 100 miles away from any of those places. The calls started around 11 a.m. while Scott was near Berkeley again, and ended around 1:30 with him in the area of Gilroy and Hollister, about an hour and a half south of the marina. Sharon later said it was no coincidence Scott left town and lied about his location on the 11th, knowing authorities were set to pull something big from the water, implying that he would have been ready to run if it had been his missing wife. But let's examine that for a moment. Do we think the police possibly used the announcement that they found a body to gauge Scott's reaction to the news? They knew they were getting their wiretap, although the application wasn't officially approved until the next day. Just after it was installed, they put the dive team back in the water. It also seems odd that they would leave a body in the water after finding it, if that's really what they thought it was, whoever it could have been. It seems they would have worked through the rough weather and gotten fresh divers to at least confirm what it was, if not the 9th then the 10th for sure, but they didn't. They let the news settle on Scott for a little while, and they made sure to explain to Sharon that it very well may not be a body, because they couldn't tell details, just rough sizes and shapes. It's unknown how large the anchor was that was recovered, but it's safe to assume it wasn't the size and shape of a body. Maybe they never saw a body on the sonar at all, but wanted Scott to believe that, so he would be rattled and make a mistake. They let the announcement saturate the news for a day or so, got the wiretap up and running, and they watched and listened. Hopeful they would hear him slip over the phone, maybe making a panicked phone call or whistling in relief when he learned it wasn't his wife. Or perhaps, they'd catch him lying to half of the people closest to him about where he was during the time they made the recovery. They also picked up another strange lie Scott told a co-worker that day, but it would be even harder to puzzle out why he was untruthful about this one. He told Robert Weaver he learned about the anchor that afternoon from Police Chief Roy Waston, though it was Sharon who'd told him about it, and phone records confirmed Scott never got a call from Waston that day. Why he lied to Weaver is unclear, but the rest of their conversation is somewhat interesting as well. They talked about the anchor recovery, the sophisticated equipment used to find it, and the fact that police assumed it was a body, and Scott chuckled when Weaver sarcastically said authorities could maybe get some money out of the anchor for their efforts. Scott pointed out that they had 60 divers working in the water that day and told Weaver at least their find was good for a laugh if nothing else. He and Weaver also talked about the discovery of another body, but when Robert brought it up, Scott said he heard that was bullshit. Later that afternoon, Scott made his way back to Modesto from Gilroy and attended prayer services with a friend from the Rotary Club. He said he was impressed by the positive energy at the church, saying he'd not been for a while, but now that he was in a crisis, he looked at religion differently. Another friend said he seemed exhausted and emotionally fragile after spending time with Scott that day, and he would soon get some news about his mother that was sure to make things even more challenging for him and his family. At some point between the 7th and the 11th, Jackie and Lee attended their first post-press meeting with law enforcement. The meetings had become routine for Sharon and the rest of Laci's family, gathering with detectives and the police chief after press conferences to receive updates and ask questions, but Jackie and Lee hadn't sat in on any of them until sometime around the 9th of January, and it didn't go extremely well. Jackie asked several questions about their ability to prosecute a suspect without a body, and Sharon became upset listening to her continue to refer to Laci as the body, recalling that she never used her name. Shortly afterward, Lee asked Police Chief Roy Waston when they would be finished investigating his son, which the chief didn't appreciate much. Waston gave him a stern look and told him they'd be done looking into Scott when they had the information they needed for their case, and no sooner, which Lee didn't care much to hear either. Lee's interaction with Waston went about as well as his meeting with Kim Peterson a few days before. Kim helped the family establish a bank account to hold donations to find Laci, and Lee wanted to know if Scott's mortgage payment could be covered by the search fund. Kim refused, saying that the people who donated the money wouldn't be expecting it to go towards his son's house payment. Scott was clearly struggling for money by mid-January, borrowing $5,000 from his father on the 14th, and attempting to get out of his lease at the Trade Corp warehouse on the same day. Scott sent an intent to vacate notice to the property management company along with a rent check for January, stating that he would be moved out by the 13th of February. Scott also requested for them to advise him of any late fees and relay the amount of the prorated rent for February. 2 days later, they responded with different ideas, basically telling him that while he was welcome to move his things out of the space, the monthly rent would need to be paid through the end of the lease in October. While he was losing his handle on his finances, his parents seemed to be struggling even harder to cope with things. Not long after their meeting with Chief Waston, Jackie had a breakdown due to the stress, and on the evening of the 11th, she was taken into the emergency room. She was vomiting and had to be put on morphine, though it's unclear why. Scott spent several hours there with her that night, and she'd recovered enough by the following day to travel to Berkeley for her grandson Tommy's christening. Tommy is Ann Bird's youngest son. Ann Bird is Jackie's daughter and Scott's half-sister, though she'd only met the Petersons a few years prior. To learn more about Ann and her complicated connection to the Petersons, you'll have to go back to earlier episodes and get caught up, but for now, let's see what she had to say about Scott at Tommy's baptism on the 12th. She thought he was followed into the church by a detective, and though she said he kept looking over his shoulder at the man with a mustache in the back pew, it's very possible he wasn't a police officer at all, but just some random man sitting in the back of the church. If you've watched the previous episodes, you'll recall that Jackie's only daughter can be a touch dramatic, so perhaps she was mistaken, and though it's certainly possible he was being followed, it was never confirmed. Anne asked Scott to hold Tommy while the pastor performed the baptism, and he thanked her for the privilege. She said he was cordial and quiet that day, just like the old Scott. But she didn't have much time with him since they'd met, only interacting a handful of times during social functions like this one, and a couple of dinners at his parents' house. She couldn't have had a good baseline to know what the old Scott was really like, but she did say he was obviously and visibly upset. They met in the parking lot of the church when he and his parents arrived before the service, and when she asked him how he was holding up, he said, "I'm not, this is a nightmare." After the baptism, Anne took them into the pastor's office, hoping he would offer some consolation and advice for her family, particularly for Scott. When they closed the door, Lee spoke first. He began to cry as he asked the rector what a family was meant to do in a situation like theirs, wanting his advice on how to get through it. But the pastor just told him there was nothing they could do, and that Laci was in God's hands. At that, Jackie chimed in, plainly frustrated and hurt. She angrily began to tell the pastor all of the things they had done and would continue to do to find Laci, making it clear that doing nothing wasn't an option. But Anne's assessment is that Jackie preferred to talk about the search and their efforts to find Laci, rather than acknowledge and work through her feelings about her going missing. However, she didn't have much more FaceTime with Jackie than she did with Scott, though they had a few additional dinners and spoke on the phone more frequently. Their time together was limited as they lived hundreds of miles away from each other, and Anne acknowledged that their phone conversations didn't delve into deep topics. It's not clear how she could make such a broad determination about her birth mother, based on the display of emotion she described from Jackie that day. Anne was in tears shortly after Lee began to speak, and as Jackie talked to the rector, Anne's eyes met Scott's, and he began to cry too. But he didn't look away, staring at her with tears welled up in his eyes, as though he was trying to tell her something. She held his gaze for a few moments, but became uncomfortable and turned away. She recalled the pastor's odd behavior with Scott as well, and expected him to offer substantial comfort and encouragement to Scott considering he was Laci's grieving husband, but he provided neither. In fact, he barely looked in his direction, seeming to intentionally avert his eyes away, and Anne said she was surprised to see that reaction, especially from a man of God. She made it seem like Scott is evil, and the pastor could just smell it on him. Perhaps he did have a sinful scent that day, as it would later be discovered that he added 2 very adult channels to his cable lineup when he got home that evening, though that doesn't in itself make him evil, just an average miscreant. So that's what the Petersons did on the 12th of January, though the only insights we have into their time together at the baptism come from a couple of pictures taken at the church, and of course, from Anne Bird's book. Jackie and Lee left the valley soon after the christening, visiting Carmel for a couple of days before heading back home to San Diego, and by the 14th of January Scott's sister-in-law Janie was the only member of his family still with him in Modesto. That evening, Sharon got a call from Scott a little after 5 o'clock. He said he wasn't far away, just over on McHenry Avenue hanging flyers, and he wanted to come over for dinner. Sharon's sister Susie dropped off a stew for her to share with Scott, but she was inclined to drop it off at his house and head home, not feeling up to having company, but then he called, so she invited him and Janie over around 6. However, even though he'd said at 5 o'clock he was close to the house hanging flyers, he called a while later and said he was running late. Sharon found out nearly a year afterward that he'd been at the police station, and his mood that night made much more sense to her after learning what they discussed just before he came over. He and Janie arrived sometime after 6 for dinner, and he hadn't even gotten inside before saying something weird. Sharon got a bad vibe as soon as she saw him, and immediately regretted inviting him over. She said hello to Janie and raised her arms to greet Scott with a hug, but he backed up a few steps and said, "You know, today someone asked me how I was doing. I said I'm doing fine." Then he smiled, and looked at Sharon telling her, "It really surprised me when I said that, because I really am doing fine." She was shocked and appalled to hear him say that, but held her tongue. She recalled angrily thinking, how in the world could you be fine? Laci's been gone for 3 weeks. This interaction seems to have set the tone for their last bizarre dinner together, and things don't seem to make much sense from here on out. They sat down together and ate the stew Susie made, but directly after dinner Ron went to the bedroom, no longer able to tolerate being around Scott, leaving Sharon with him and Janie. She was upset, and the evening continued to go downhill as time drew on. But Sharon finally started asking some questions when Kim Peterson called a little while later and Scott wanted to speak with her. Sharon handed the phone over and heard him tell Kim that they needed to make corrections in the media about Connor's due date, changing it from the 10th to the 16th. Sharon was beyond confused by what she was hearing. She and the rest of the family had been telling the world Laci was due on the 10th of February, asking the public to watch for her around local hospitals and clinics as the date drew closer. She was shocked to hear him tell Kim she was actually due on the 16th. She didn't know where he'd gotten that information, and why he hadn't mentioned it to her before. She also couldn't believe Laci wouldn't have told her about the date change before she'd gone missing. Laci gave Sharon updates about the baby throughout her entire pregnancy, and she was bewildered as to why her daughter didn't share such big news with her. So when Scott got off the call with Kim, Sharon spoke up. She asked him when the due date changed, but he just went silent and wouldn't respond. She repeated the question a little louder, "Scott, when did Laci's due date change?" But he just stared at her, or more accurately, through her as if she wasn't there, silently fixing his vacant gaze somewhere beyond her, as though she no longer existed. Sharon wondered later if that was how he'd looked at Laci, before he ended her life. She dropped the subject about the due date and the 3 of them sat down in front of the TV together, which seems a bit odd, after the exchange they'd just had. Sharon said she was seething and her mind was racing over the date change, but she didn't mention it again.
The baby is due on the 10th of February, which is this coming Monday. We've confirmed that date. It's not the 16th. I know people have been putting it in the paper and the news that it's the 16th. The date has been confirmed the 10th.
They'd had some conflict about Laci's website that night too, and as Scott became frustrated with her for objecting to allowing a stranger who she didn't trust work on it, she saw a flash of anger on his face that she'd never seen before, and it scared her. She later said she felt like she'd gotten a flash of his true self, a dark part of his personality he must have kept buried deep, and at that moment, he knew she'd seen it. He immediately jumped back into trying to convince her to let the rude stranger work on the website a split second later, and Sharon caved. What she knew of the stranger who'd volunteered hadn't sat well with her from the onset, and after he'd sent some insulting emails to their current admin Jonathan, Sharon flat out didn't like him. But when Scott startled her by snatching the emails from her hand and she'd seen that look on his face, she relented and told him to let the jerky volunteer fix the website. But strangely, after all of this, including his comment about how fine he was 3 weeks into his wife's disappearance, and his death stare when she asked about the due date, and then seeing his true villainous self when he got angry, they all sat down to watch TV. So as the program came on, Sharon explained that they were about to watch Greta, a primetime news talk show that had covered the case relentlessly since the end of December, and her guest that night had taken a small boat just like Scott's out to the bay to fish for sturgeon, and Scott said, "Seriously?" Then he asked her if she'd heard about what divers found in the bay near Oakland that day. Police dredged a channel next to a boat launch there and discovered a car with 2 missing fishermen inside that had vanished in November. He said, "I mean, they know who they are, apparently they got drunk and drove into the bay. That'll be an interesting story for Greta, huh?" But he had to have known when he said it, that a much bigger story was about to break. As they listened to the expert fishermen on the program talk about using shrimp to catch sturgeon, Sharon said, "So Scott, what type of bait did you use?" He was up wandering around the room and she couldn't see his face to gauge his reaction, but Jamie answered the question, saying he hadn't used bait but fished with lures. Prompting Sharon to say, "Well, was it at least shaped like a shrimp?" He looked over his shoulder at her and chuckled, but said nothing. A few minutes later, he noticed the stack of newspapers she was saving with articles about Laci and dismissively waved his hand over the pile saying, "I'm not keeping any of those, Laci wouldn't want to see it." Sharon disagreed, pointing out the headline on the top of the stack announcing the opening of a second volunteer center at a Red Lion hotel in Los Angeles, and she told him Laci would be happy to hear about the number of people who were concerned and looking for her, but Scott just shook his head and stayed silent. He and Jamie left not long after, and Sharon was relieved to see him go, but still angry after he left. She went into the bedroom to find Ron still awake and told him, "I think this is the first time I can say, Scott really pissed me off." Although the past 3 weeks had been torturous for Sharon, she couldn't have imagined the true hell her life was about to become, though she seemed to sense it that night as she saw her son-in-law in person, for the last time as a free man. She'd felt his bad energy from the moment he walked through her door, and by the time he left, she knew something was about to break. He'd been rude, cocky, and uncaring all evening, and although it'd been months before she made the connection as to why, detectives were about to give her some insight into his behavior, by sharing some devastating facts about Scott they'd been keeping to themselves. It turns out he wasn't hanging flyers on McHenry Avenue that evening, but at the police station being confronted for the first time, with solid proof that he'd been cheating on his missing pregnant wife, for weeks. Thanks so much for watching. Subscribe and join us next time, as all hell breaks loose in Modesto over the woman at the heart of the case against Scott Peterson, and follow us back over the weeks before Laci disappeared, to learn about the life he created for himself, in the mind of his new mistress. If you enjoy the content and want to hear more stories like this one, please consider supporting the channel with the super thanks button below, or visiting our Patreon page linked in the description, and of course, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Thanks for your support. Until next time, stay safe, be kind, and memento mori.